All right, I see a typo here. This should be part 3. So this is the third and final part of lecture 8. Let's address some common areas of confusion in people's understanding of concepts of evolution, and specifically and also natural selection. Okay, and one of them is at what biological level do evolution and adaptation occur at? And all too commonly, people think that these processes are something that affects the level of the individual, and that is simply not true. It's very, very important to remember that evolution and the adaptations that result from evolution, and adaptation is a change in a physical property of an organism that affects its fitness. For example, in the previous part of this lecture, we talked about how beak size got larger in finch populations, and that is an adaptation. Those larger beaks are an adaptation to survive better in drought conditions. So both evolution and adaptation occur at the level of populations. Evolution acts on populations, not on individuals. Very important to remember that. Another common misperception is that it's about survival of the species. And in fact, many of us professors will use sloppy language in this regard as well, but it's not true. So natural selection is not about ensuring the survival of the species. It only acts in the here and now. It is not a directed, thoughtful process that plans ahead for the future. It's simply something that happens as a response to selection pressure, to drought, or to the presence of antibiotics if you're a group of bacteria, or a new food source, or a different color of tree that might affect the impact of your coloration pattern. Okay, it happens in the here and now. It's not a directed process. So let's address some of the terminology that's relevant here. The word adaptation is a noun, so strictly speaking, an adaptation is a trait that increases an individual's fitness. It's something that is beneficial in a given environment. And to adapt, which is to use that word as a verb, is a process by which populations evolve through natural selection, and it involves genetic changes within the populations. So adaptations are, here we see an insect that has a body pattern that makes it look just like the leaves that it is sitting on, so it's extremely well camouflaged. That's an adaptation that helps that insect survive and therefore reproduce in this environment. Here we have another example of a coloration pattern that is an adaptation. This ptarmigan is able to sit on her nest and blend in almost perfectly with the background, so she's much less likely to be predated. Therefore, she's more likely to survive and to reproduce. So I would say her camouflage coloration pattern is certainly an adaptation. Another camouflage pattern, that's an example of an adaptation, an extremely odd looking but beautiful one. We see those sorts of patterns in many insect species. And finally, a famous cartoon by Gary Larson, a Far Side cartoon, showing a group of organisms that are looking kind of like primitive dolphins, and they're eyeing that ball that they were playing with that's trapped up on the terrestrial environment. And it is, again, this cartoon maybe reinforces some bad ideas. It's just meant for a little bit of humor, but it's not possible for those particular individuals to evolve in this moment. And of course, having the ball probably does not confer any kind of fitness advantage. So the ball being up there wouldn't really be considered a selection pressure. This is just a little bit of fun. Let's now bring this discussion around to microbiology and the microbiology of infectious disease. So a reason why it's important to understand evolution and to understand that it is happening all the time. Evolution is ongoing, okay? Our populations are not static. They are not fixed from a genetic point of view. They're constantly changing and evolving. And this is really relevant in our life. If you think about microbes, one of the things we'll be learning about later in class is just how fast microbes reproduce. So E. coli, for example, can replicate or can copy itself wherein one cell becomes 2 during the process of binary fission. It can do that in 20 minutes. So in E. coli, you can have one generation in 20 minutes. That means 3 generations in an hour. And when you have populations that replicate that quickly, evolution can happen really quickly in time frames that are incredibly meaningful to the human existence. And so when you have antibiotic-resistant microbes within a population, so let's say you have a population of 1,000 E. coli and one of them is resistant to antibiotics, and then that person takes those antibiotics and it kills off most of the population, but that one survives, okay? Because it has an adaptation, and the adaptation is to be resistant to antibiotics. Then that one has access to a lot of food and space, and it will replicate. And so we'll see, very, very quickly, we'll see a population of E. coli where most of the E. coli are resistant to antibiotics. And this is what's happening within our bodies and within environments like hospitals, intensive care units, for example. This graph here on the lower right is showing the percent of bacteria isolated from patients in U.S. hospital intensive care units during the 1990s, actually from 83 up until 2001. And it's showing us the rise in the number of microbes that are resistant to the key antibiotic vancomycin. It's an antibiotic we rely on when many others fail. And so this is very, very disturbing. This is showing us that in 1983, most of them were not resistant to antibiotics, but by, right about here, in the late 1990s, we're seeing close to 25%, or 1 in 4 of those isolates are resistant to antibiotics. And that is because we're putting a selection pressure on those populations. The resistance is already there because there's diversity or variation in that phenotype in the population. We apply the selection pressure of antibiotic exposure, and then we see selection against those that are not resistant to antibiotics. The ones that are resistant start to multiply, and the population shows us much greater numbers of antibiotic-resistant microbes. And we've seen this since the 1940s, okay, when penicillin, the first therapeutic antibiotic, was used. Earlier in class, we talked about the use of antibiotics for promoting growth in pigs, chickens, and other agriculturally relevant animals. And if you think about the fact that in the US and Canada, most antibiotics are used simply to help livestock grow heavier and faster so that there can be more profits and larger amounts of meat provided to consumers, that's pretty disturbing. All of that antibiotics in the environment, all those antibiotics in the environment confer a tremendous selection pressure for or in favor of antibiotic-resistant microbes. And that's a little depressing. Now, on the bright side, in Denmark, back in the 1990s, there was a ban imposed on the use of antibiotics in livestock as growth promoters. If your cow or your chicken gets sick, you can still give it antibiotics, but you can't give them antibiotics just to help them grow faster or heavier. And the data from that particular nationwide experiment is really, really exciting. So let's focus up here on the graph on the top left, okay? Here we see years from 95 to 2000, 95 to 2000, running across the bottom axis, and we see percent resistance, and that means resistance to the antibiotic erythromycin, okay? And that is in a particular two types of bacteria, Enterobacter faecium and Enterobacter faecalis, okay? Two common kinds of bacteria found in livestock, and those bacteria can be transmitted to the people that eat that livestock or that work with that livestock. And the great news is that these lines are going down, okay? And so we're seeing a decline in antibiotic resistance in these bacterial populations, which makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. If you remove the selection pressure, then there's nothing maintaining the requirement for being antibiotic resistant in those populations. And so all members of the population can reproduce equally, and those that are not antibiotic resistant are starting to show a comeback, and that's good for human health. We see something similar with the antibiotic vancomycin, something similar over here. This is the different type of study. Over here it was pigs, and over here it's broilers. Those are types of chickens. When we stop feeding chickens antibiotics, we see erythromycin resistance come down just as it did in pigs. Again, here on the left is pigs, here on the right is broilers. When we stop feeding them antibiotics, in all cases we're seeing resistance go down. So that's really, really encouraging that we could see the same thing in the United States, especially given that if you read the posting that I sent you a little while ago, that Congress has passed a bill that is starting to make it much harder to feed antibiotics to livestock simply for growth promotion. So I think there's really good reason to hope that we're going to see some improvement on the antibiotic resistance front, and that's going to be helpful for preserving and promoting human health. Not really so much relevant to microbiology, but maybe just interesting to you, is also the idea of artificial selection. So a great example of that is pet breeds. For example, the dog breeds shown in this picture. Artificial selection is when we have human-mediated natural selection, usually with some sort of intention. And the best example of that is what I've got here, for the example of deliberately breeding or promoting the breeding of certain phenotypes. And while this has resulted in many different types of dogs that are useful for different purposes for humans, in most cases, these highly bred animals also have some adverse health effects, and so there's definitely a movement by many animal rights types to try to favor mutts or so-called limited edition dogs rather than purebreds. I somehow doubt that we're actually going to stop breeding purebred dogs, but I hope that we can do it with a better understanding of genetics so that we can minimize the incidence of adverse conditions like breathing problems and hip dysplasia. But again, here we are imposing natural selection on populations that we have control over. And finally, here are some examples of quiz questions. Could you define evolution, adaptation, and fitness? You could also, I would say, can you explain natural selection? Can you say or state who first described evolution and when? Can you explain how a study of finch beak depth could be used to demonstrate natural selection? Could you explain why is it wrong to say that an organism evolved to better survive? Could you explain what's wrong with that statement? Could you explain how the decline of antibiotic-resistant bacteria recovered from pigs in Denmark is an illustration of the principles of evolution by natural selection? And similarly, how would an increase in the number of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in your GI tract right after you took 2 weeks' worth of antibiotics for a chest cold, how could that be an illustration of evolution by natural selection? Let's see if you can come up with answers to these, and we will discuss them. And remember that you should be ready to hand in your notes, the notes that you made from viewing the 3 parts of this lecture in class when we meet next. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.